So this week we're studying logic. Last week we studied consistency and inconsistency. It can be tricky business sometimes, logic. The field of logic, the study of logic, is not really trying to describe the psychology of how people argue, but how they ought to argue. What makes a good argument? What follows from what? So it's about ideal reasoning. And when you're ideally reasoning well, you are said to be logical. Now, the field of logic also explores errors to which people can be prone to make when the reasoning drifts away from these ideals of correct reasoning. And we label kinds of errors fallacies. So a fallacy is a kind of error in reasoning. But the key idea is that the field of logic explores the structural properties of reasoning. It doesn't just collect bags of good reasoning and bags of bad reasoning, right? And the structure is called logical form. So we're going to be looking at logical form. Now there's an example of an argument, and we can write out its logical form in terms of capital letters to help us sort of understand the structure. So it's a dog, a fox, or a coyote. That's a single sentence. And you can see it as a string of three clauses strung together with a connective that we call disjunction or. Now the structure of arguments come from the structure of the sentences that compose them. So here's a 4-sentence argument made of 3 premises and a conclusion. And we can see that the premises have the structure of D or F or C, not F, not C. So it's got to be D by a process of elimination. That's a valid argument, a good argument. And we can see its structure laid out in front of us very simply like that. Now, what's especially important about noticing structure is that if you find another argument with the same structure, if the structure supports it being a good argument, then the new argument, both arguments are going to be valid or good if they both have that structure. So let's see how that works. There's 2 arguments that have the same form. The reigning argument and the Russian argument. Take a look at those. The form is in the middle. The form R, and if R not P, from which you conclude not P, is a good form in the sense of any argument that has that form is going to be a good argument in the sense of deductively valid. Even if you change the word Russian to the word Greek, we're going to look at a great division in the field of logic between deductive and inductive arguments. We're going to try to learn the difference between the 2 kinds of arguments, but ultimately, on quiz questions, you're not going to be asked, is this deductive or is this inductive? It's more a matter of if you understand the difference, then you'll be able to understand other aspects of the reasoning. You'll be better able to assess the quality of reasoning. And I'll show you a lot of examples to illustrate this fact. So I mentioned this phrase, deductively valid reasoning. That's the goal of what we call deductive argumentation, deductive arguments. The idea is let's make the conclusion follow with certainty from the premises. That's the goal of a deductive argument. The goal of an inductive argument is just to get the conclusion to have some solid probability given the premises. The inductive argument there, the Boy Scout and the soccer coach are giving testimony in court. They both testify that the victim was shot by this woman. So the conclusion is she shot the victim. It's probable, maybe enough to get her convicted, but it doesn't follow with the same kind of certainty that the argument above about the cat and the dog do. So when we distinguish deductive from inductive arguments, we're really looking into the intention of the speaker, the arguer. Now, the simplest piece of reasoning is an argument that draws one conclusion from one premise. And you've got that in that first deductive argument. And of course, arguments can have any number of premises. Okay, so the main point here is that inductive reasoning, that is, reasoning that's intending to give inductive arguments, is less secure than deductive reasoning. So, two different goals. In deductive argumentation, we're looking for whether the argument is deductively valid, that is, its conclusion follows certainty, or not. Then we say it's deductively invalid. Now, if the deductive argument goes beyond that, and it's not just that it's deductively valid, but also that we're in a position to say the premises are all true, then we say the argument is deductively sound, S-O-U-N-D. So that's a higher standard. Not just that it's deductively valid, but that it's sound. All arguments are either valid or invalid. All arguments are either sound or unsound. There's no middle ground, such as being somewhat valid. Validity doesn't come in degrees. But inductive strength does. So an inductive argument is an argument that's intended by the arguer to be strong enough that if the premises were to be true, then it would be unlikely that the conclusion is false. But likeliness is a matter of degree. So an argument's success or strength is a matter of degree. It doesn't mean you can always put a number on it, but it comes in degrees of strength. Higher, lower, even higher, even lower. Now, the strength of that above the argument we were looking at about testimony would be even stronger if you had more witnesses. So the difference between the two kinds of arguments, the deductive arguments and the inductive arguments, doesn't really lie just in the words given. You can't just look for a word in the argument and say, oh, that's deductive, or oh, that's inductive. It comes from you, the investigator or listener, peering into the mind of the person arguing, looking at their intentions. If the arguer believes the truth of the premises definitely establish the truth of the conclusion, if that's their intention, then their argument is deductive. If the arguer believes that the truth of the premises provides good reasons to believe the conclusion, but not certain reasons or definitive reasons, then the argument's inductive. But if you don't know what's going on in the head of the arguer, if you can't tell from the context what's happened before, from the situation, the clues, then you just have to check for both. Does it meet both standards? Is this argument deductively valid? Is it inductively strong? Right? Normally you check for deductive validity first. Inductive strength is a matter of degree, and deductive validity and deductive soundness aren't. Deductive reasoning is more cut and dry than inductive reasoning. And actually your civilization knows much more about the structure of deductive reasoning than inductive reasoning. Nevertheless, inductive reasoning isn't just a matter of personal preference. Oh, it feels strong to me. I mean, there are standards by which experts will say, come to an agreement on the strength of an argument. Again, it's all a matter of whether the premises ought to promote the higher degree of belief in the conclusion. Again, logic is prescriptive, not descriptive, right? It prescribes or says whether the argument ought to persuade. It's not descriptive. It's not describing how arguments work on people. That's really the field of psychology, the description of arguments. Now, sometimes in a deductively sound argument, we say the conclusion is contained within the premises. It's like somebody can extract it. If they just open up the premises, it just falls right out. Just a metaphor. But because of this idea of squeezing the conclusion out of the premises, deductive arguments, the success of or quality of deductive arguments often turns on using definitions and more rigorous rules, as we're going to see. Now, what do we mean by rules? Well, let's take a peek. Suppose I say John is ill, and if John is ill, then he won't be able to attend our meeting today. From which you can draw the conclusion John won't be able to attend our meeting today. Right? The argument is valid because of its formal structure or logical structure, its logical form. If you replace the word ill with the word happy, you'd have just as strong of an argument. Maybe the premises wouldn't be true, but the argument strength would be the same. It still has the form of P, if P then Q, so Q. That kind of structure from P and if P then Q, those two premises, to a conclusion Q, that kind of structure actually has a name. It's called modus ponens. You've been studying about that, M-O-D-U-S, P-O-N-E-N-S. That's a rule. It's a rule of logic. Modus ponens is a rule of logic. And if an argument has that as its structure, if it follows that rule, then we say it's a valid argument. Now you can think of those capital letters as variables because the P could be replaced by L, right? As long as it's everywhere in the argument. And you'd have a good argument. Okay, the study of argumentation where you represent sentences with capital letters and how they're strung together, and you don't go into the sentence and get out its verbs and direct objects and things like that. It's called propositional logic. So there's an example of an argument in propositional logic. We've looked at an argument in that form, haven't we? Right? This process of elimination. Got three cases, you can eliminate two of the three, so you conclude the third. That's actually a rule that has a name that we won't bother with right now, but I just call it the process of elimination. If you follow that rule, you've got a good argument. Regardless of what the D is abbreviating. Now, inductive arguments have forms too, but the forms are a little harder to see. One famous form of an inductive argument is called the appeal to authority, where the premises appeal to some authority's belief about something and then draws the conclusion that that belief is true. So a typical authority in some situations might be a doctor. When authorities are speaking out of their area of expertise, you don't trust them any more than anybody else. If your subject is whether or not something is a rule in the game of Scrabble, you can't trust a doctor any more than your neighbor that you play Scrabble with. So assessing the strength of an inductive argument that appeals to authority is a much more subtle enterprise. That argument about the doctor and the measles is not deductively valid, but still might be good enough. Now, we've been using this word valid and deduced and so forth. You have to watch out that not everybody uses the words the way your logic teacher does. Some lawyers will tell their juries that they presented a valid argument, but then we as critical thinkers have to realize, oh, they're using valid in another sense, like a synonym for good or something, right? From the barest clues, the English detective Sherlock Holmes, fictional detective, deduced who murdered whom. But he didn't really deduce in our sense of deduce. He just made an educated guess. Strictly speaking, he produced an inductive argument. So Sherlock Holmes wasn't really deducing. He was an expert at induction. Now, Charles Darwin, who discovered the biological processes of evolution, is famous for his deduction that circular atolls in the ocean are actually coral growths on top of barely submerged volcanoes. But he really performed induction and not deduction. Now, some dictionaries and even textbooks define the word deduction as reasoning from the general to the specific, as reasoning from the general to the specific, and define induction as reasoning from the specific to the general. That's an old-fashioned 19th century definition that's gone away by and large, because there's so many exceptions. For example, here's an inductive argument. It goes from the specific to the specific. I saw her kiss him, so I'm sure she's having an affair. It's an inductive argument, but now the mathematical proof technique called mathematical induction, it's also deductive and not inductive. So again, we critical thinkers have to be alert to the use of these words. Additional problem we have when we use these words like deductive and inductive is that the same utterance can be used to present either a deductive argument or an inductive argument. It all depends on what the arguer believes. For example, here's a short argument. Dom Perignon is a champagne, so it must be made in France. Inductive or deductive? Well, it depends. It might be clear from the context that whoever said that, the speaker, the arguer, believes that having been made in the Champagne area of France is part of the defining feature of Champagne. With that in the background as one of the hidden premises, then the conclusion follows from the premises with certainty. It's a deductively valid argument. But maybe the arguer has no such intentions at all. They don't have that in mind. Right? They might merely believe that most champagne is made in France. Most champagne is made in France. So they're reasoning probabilistically. That is, the intention is to give an inductive argument. So you can't tell just from the words. So the distinction between deductive and inductive has to do with the strength of the justification that the premises can give. And it has to do with what the arguer believes or intends the strength to be. Now, given the way we've used the terms deductive and inductive argument, an argument's always one or the other, never both. But in deciding which one of the two it is, there's oftentimes not enough evidence to tell one way or the other. So we assess the argument with both standards. How is it as a deductively valid argument? Not, okay, how is it as an inductively strong argument? Given that perspective, we oftentimes find out what an argument assumes, what its premises are, by seeing, well, what would need to be assumed to make it be deductively valid? What would need to be assumed to make it inductively strong? And then we ask ourselves, okay, can we say implicitly those assumptions are being made here? Or can we say, well, if you make those assumptions, they're terrible assumptions, and that alone shoots down the argument? Okay, let's take a look at an example. So we've talked about implicit features of arguments, right? Things that are unsaid, like implicit premises. You say, well, that's the premise in the argument, but he just didn't bother to say it. And usually in argumentation, you don't say everything you're assuming to get the conclusion to follow. Oftentimes it clutters up your reasoning to say too much. For example, suppose the question is, did Julius Caesar conquer Rome? Now in response, somebody might argue like this. Yeah, he conquered Rome, because the general of the Roman legions of Gaul crossed the Rubicon River and conquered Rome. And Julius Caesar was once the general of the Roman legions in Gaul. How good of an argument is that? Well, what do you mean by once? Once, I mean, once at this, and then this is the time? That he was the general at the time the army crossed the Rubicon? If so, you got a valid argument here. But was once. The premises could be true, but Julius Caesar might not have been the general of the Roman legions at the right time. Maybe it was General Tiberius who crossed the Rubicon River and conquered Rome. So unless you get the timing right, you can't be sure whether that's a good argument or not. Did the speaker actually intend you to assume that Julius Caesar was commander of the army at the right time? It all depends. So it takes some detective work to understand arguments. And we're going to be doing a lot of detective work this week in figuring out the quality of an argument, whether it's deductively valid, whether it's inductively strong. And we're going to be using our detective skills to figure out what are the ingredients of the argument. Is that a premise? Is that not a premise?